Okay, so in this video, we're going to do the post lab for Predicting Precipitates Part 2 lab. So I've just cut out a screenshot of the analysis section. So in other words, this is your post lab. So it says on a separate sheet of paper, so make sure you have this on a different piece of paper. You are going to use your data table that you've already filled in, and you're going to answer these questions. So it says create a table on your paper like the one listed below for 3 combinations that produced a precipitate. So you can pick any 3 that made a precipitate for your data. So what it's going to look like is this table right here. One thing I want to tell you about this table, though, is where it says precipitate and the other product, just don't worry about that. You can write the precipitate first or second. So I'm going to create a table real quick, just like the one above. So I have reactant 1 plus reactant 2 yields product 1 plus product 2. And again, it doesn't matter if you put the precipitate first or second. Don't worry about that. So this is our example one, and you do not need to include this one in your table. You're just going to have 3 different reactions for 3 that made a precipitate from your data. So this is what it would look like if this was my reaction. So I'd write cobalt 2 chloride under either reactant 1 or 2. It doesn't matter. And make sure if you have a Roman numeral, you include it because that tells us the charge of the transition metal. So cobalt 2 chloride plus potassium hydroxide. So here's my other reactant. And then that's going to yield, okay, my products. Remember, in a double replacement reaction, we take the cation, for the first thing, the metals, and we switch spots. So cobalt and potassium are going to switch spots. So for product 1, I'm going to put potassium where cobalt was. So I'm going to have potassium, and then I keep the chloride. So potassium chloride is my first product. And my second, cobalt, make sure you keep that Roman numeral 2 because it tells us the charge of the transition metal, which won't change whether it's a reactant or a product. So cobalt 2. And then this time we're going to have hydroxide as our second product. Now, if you happen to write cobalt 2 hydroxide for your first product and potassium chloride for your second, that is totally fine. Okay, so that's part A. It says write the word equation. So here's our part A for this first example. Then part B, we're going to do B and C kind of together. So B, comma, C will go together. So B says write the full chemical equation with correct formula. So don't forget to balance out the charges when you do this. So let's look at cobalt 2 chloride. So I'll do a little scratch work over here. Cobalt, the Roman numeral plus 2 tells us, or the Roman numeral 2 tells us a plus 2 charge. Chloride is a halogen, group 17, almost at the end of the periodic table. So if you look at your periodic table, you know that's minus 1. So plus 2 minus 1 doesn't cancel out. So we're going to need 2 chlorines and 1 cobalt. So we have CoCl2 plus potassium hydroxide. So potassium's an alkali metal or group 1. So it's plus 1. And then hydroxide, don't forget, that one's tricky. It's a polyatomic ion. So flip your periodic table over and look. It's OH minus 1. So those do cancel out. So we have KOH. Notice I'm giving myself room so that I can go back and balance my equation. So don't squish everything together. And just try to keep it underneath the columns, like under the headings, like reactant 2, reactant 1, and so forth. So for the products, potassium chloride, well, I know my charge of potassium is plus 1 and chloride is minus 1. They don't change from the reactants to the products, so that would be KCl. Plus my second product, now I have cobalt plus 2, hydroxide is minus 1. That doesn't balance out, so I have to have 2 hydroxides, so CO. Now don't forget, hydroxide is a polyatomic ion, so we must put it in parentheses, so OH, and then a 2 on the outside. So there is part 1, right? The full chemical equations are B of this part. Then C says balance the equation using our correct coefficients and the states of matter. So I want to remind you, aqueous, AQ, if you have to write an aqueous, this means dissolved in water. So anything that is soluble is going to be aqueous. And then you're going to include an S for solid by the precipitate. Now remember, this precipitate, this solid, is only a product. So you should not have any S's on the reactant side. So cobalt 2 chloride is aqueous, and potassium hydroxide is aqueous. Now we have to look at our solubility rules to figure out which one of these potassium chloride or cobalt-2 hydroxide is insoluble. So you need to look at your solubility rules. Well, on your chart, there's a rule on the back of your periodic table, your solubility chart. It says potassium, doesn't say potassium specifically, but it says alkali metals, which potassium is, are always soluble. Or you might look under chloride and it says chloride is soluble with the exceptions of lead 2, silver 1, or lead 4, silver 1, or mercury 2, which potassium is none of those, so that's also soluble. So whether you look at the potassium rule or the chloride, they're both soluble, so we're going to put in aqueous. And then we go to cobalt-2 hydroxide. There's no rule specifically for cobalt on the solubility rules, but hydroxide is. Hydroxide says insoluble, exceptions, group 1 and heavy group 2, which are calcium, strontium, and barium. Well, cobalt isn't in group 1, it's a transition metal, and it's not calcium, strontium, or barium, so that means this is insoluble. In other words, that's your precipitate. So we put an S next to it. Now the final thing says make sure we balance this using coefficients. So let's do that. We have 1 cobalt on the reactants, 1 on the product, so that's balanced. Chlorine, 2 chlorines on the reactants, but only 1 on the product. So I'm going to put a coefficient of 2 in front of potassium chloride. Remember, don't add subscripts. That's only to get the charges to balance. Now we're balancing the equation, so we use coefficients. So 2 potassiums now are in the products, so let's make 2 in the reactants. So there's 2 KOH. Now by doing that, I have 2 hydroxides on the reactants or the left side, and I already have a coefficient of 2, so that's all balanced. So part B and C are done. The last part, this is question number 2. So for question number 2, they want us to draw a picture of what we just drew, or just wrote. So we're going to have 3 beakers. So here's our first beaker, plus our second beaker, and we're going to yield our products. The products will all be in 1 beaker. So for the first beaker, it's going to be the aqueous copper 2 chloride. So since it's aqueous, I'm going to put a little water in here. So there's my water. And remember, when it's aqueous, it breaks up into cations and anions. So what was our cation? What's our anion? Well, cobalt was our cation. So we have CO, and make sure you put the correct charge. It was cobalt 2, so CO plus 2. And then our anion is chloride, Cl minus 1. But don't stop there. You have 2 chlorides, so we have to make it 2 chlorides in our beaker. So we have 1 cobalt plus 2 ion, 2 chlorides. Then we go to the potassium hydroxide. Again, this is aqueous. So I'm going to have a little water in there. You can ignore the coefficient of 2. Just focus on this formula. So we have 1 potassium ion and 1 hydroxide ion, because it's a 1-to-1 ratio. Now I go to my product side. My solid is the cobalt-2 hydroxide. Solids are going to sink to the bottom, and they don't break up into ions. So that just stays COOH2. Notice I write the whole formula, and I'm just going to kind of make it a clump of solid on the bottom of the beaker. So that's my solid. But I also have aqueous potassium chloride. So I'm going to have a little water in here, potassium ions, because it's aqueous, it splits, and chloride. There's 1 potassium, 1 chloride, so I leave it plus 1, K plus 1, and 1 Cl minus 1. Again, you can ignore the coefficient of 2. So that is how you're going to do your post-lab questions. Remember, you don't need to write any of this down. This is just an example. You're going to pick 3 for number 1 to write the word equation and the balance equation. And then for part 2, it says just choose 1 of the 3 things that you did above to draw the model up. And then you'll turn this in along with your data table.